Block 15, The Prussian Wars of Liberation, 1812 to 1814. Socio-political background. The 30 Years' War left the German-speaking principalities under the influence and control of France, which promoted the sovereignty of the German princes and their establishment of autocratic regimes. The ideas of princely absolutism, which built on the concept of inequality formulated by Aristotle several hundred years earlier, found expression in the writings of Niccolò Machiavelli and were also adopted by the French Emperor Louis XIV, who wrote in his instructions to the Dauphin, "We are the representatives of God. Nobody has the right to criticize our actions. Whoever is born a subject must obey without asking." According to Sims, both rural and urban communities within the 18th century German principalities were under a hierarchical structure in which domination and obligation played a key role. He describes the 150 years from the 30 Years' War to the French Revolution as a continuous struggle for dominance in Europe, fueled by the imperial efforts of those in power. Sims refers to a quote from the contemporary German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who described Germany as the battlefield on which the struggle for European supremacy took place. He explains that Germany at the end of the 18th century consisted of a loose collection of independent, semi-independent and dependent territories that made up the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the philosophies of the Enlightenment continued to spread in Europe, sparking criticism of absolutist state governments and their oppressive regimes. This critical attitude and the increasing social injustices contributed to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Sims explains how a more equal and unified French society was created under the banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the process, all feudal privileges were abolished and replaced by a social order based on merit rather than birth. Church property was nationalized, while the church itself was placed under the government, and pressure was placed on the kingdom's many national and linguistic minorities to adopt the French language and culture. Since this new social structure challenged the feudalistic societies of neighboring Western and Central European countries, the impression arose that the new regime would only have a chance of survival if the revolution was spread across Europe. To achieve this was initially the ideological intention of the Revolutionary Wars. The Holy Roman Empire was seen as an enemy because it represented everything that the new regime despised, a reactionary jumble of small ecclesiastical areas and principalities. The philosopher and political activist Thomas Paine, who was instrumental in both the American Wars of Liberation and the French Revolution, wrote in a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette in 1792, "I hope it ends in a war against German despotism and in the liberation of all of Germany. If France will be surrounded by revolutions, she will be in peace and security." A French revolutionary wrote in the same year, "The Holy Roman Empire, this monstrous assembly of despots, great and small, must also disappear under the impact of our incredible revolution. The Kingdom of France supported it. The French Republic will work for its destruction." Since the revolutionaries felt that they were surrounded on all sides by hostile powers, they called on French society to rise to the challenge, founded revolutionary armies, and introduced universal conscription in 1793. Napoleon Bonaparte, the most victorious general in the revolutionary armies, became so politically powerful that he was crowned French emperor in 1804 with the crown of Charlemagne. According to Sims, Napoleon primarily wanted to dominate Europe and unite it on French terms and for France's benefit. The execution of this plan required him to control Germany in order to secure its resources and use the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire for his own imperial purposes. Reinhardt points out that the Napoleonic invasion of Germany was inspired by the same imperial motives that initiated the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. Napoleon himself declared, "I will play the role that Richelieu assigned to France." In doing so, he continued the imperialist efforts of Louis XIV. Napoleon eventually achieved his goal and defeated both the Prussian and Austrian armies, leading to the inglorious end of the Holy Roman Empire. The experience of loss of territory, loss of sovereignty, and disarmament that was the result of the 30 Years' War was repeated with Napoleon's triumphant entry into Berlin, and the following years, which were marked by occupation and demands for war reparations. According to Sims, this experience of invasion, division, and occupation by France traumatized an entire generation of Germans. Socio-cultural background. The historian Karen Hagemann describes how Napoleon's victory over the Prussian army in 1806 led to a social, political, and economic crisis in Prussia, affecting large parts of the population and sparking an intense public debate in patriotic circles about the origins of the defeat. The betrayal of the German princes who had joined Napoleon, along with the lack of national attitude, was blamed for the defeat. It also became clear that the Prussian state and its military were in need of fundamental reform, and that French-style universal conscription was necessary to counter French oppression. Hagemann describes how the awakening of a nationalist spirit and the construction of a German national myth became a necessity in an attempt to build a patriotic willingness to sacrifice. According to Hagemann, the willingness to take up arms was further strengthened by the middle class's hope for political emancipation. While the French occupation lasted until 1808, the Prussian king entered into an alliance with Napoleon before the Grand Army's invasion of Russia in 1812 and made Prussia a deployment area for the invading troops, further increasing economic hardship. When Napoleon was defeated in Russia in December 1812, censorship of nationalist propaganda was lifted, and patriotic sentiments were spread across a variety of media to mobilize the population for the coming war. According to Hagemann, the role of songs was particularly important in this context, as songs could reach even less educated sections of society. She emphasizes the tradition of the military song, which was already used as a propaganda medium during the French Revolution. Hagemann makes clear that the most important function of patriotic songs and poems appeared to provide historical and religious legitimacy for the armed struggle and to provide emotionally charged images and stereotypes that promoted a collective self-perception. The image of the nation as a national family and the army as a community of brothers falls under this category. Religious and popular language enabled patriotic songs and poems to appeal to all classes by drawing on common knowledge and accepted norms. According to Hagemann, patriotic propaganda literature also promoted the concept of the German national character, who was constructed as a counter-image to the hostile French neighbor, virtuous, sensitive, profound, loyal, upright, and brave. In contrast to patriotic songs that portrayed armed combat as a joyful task, there were also anti-patriotic and pacifist songs that showed that enthusiasm for war and the fatherland was not evenly distributed among the population. It was not only language-based media that played an important role in promoting patriotic feelings, but also painting, sculpture, and architecture, which were used to promote a sense of collective identity through the construction of a national historical and mythological past. The cultural historian Robin Lenman describes how, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a market for contemporary art began to develop with picture lotteries and traveling exhibitions organized by art unions, leading to the establishment and growth of art academies and national galleries, and to the production, exhibition, and the sale of paintings. It was also an effort to overcome what was perceived as Germany's cultural deficit towards other European nations and its failure to challenge the artistic hegemony of France. Lenman highlights that international exhibitions of contemporary art became masculinity contests between European countries similarly affected by the Napoleonic Wars and now also using art as a propaganda medium. Interest in history as an academic discipline, which had begun before the 18th century, was also suddenly stimulated by the Napoleonic occupation, fueled by the urge to focus on distant and more glorious times in order to evoke patriotic feelings and to convey a sense of collective identity. Lenman describes how historical societies and museums were founded and how history became an important part of intellectual debates, had a significant influence on architecture, became a theme in literature and in painting, now ranking third after biblical and mythological themes. Investment in public art in the form of frescoes, sculptures, and monuments was intended to further help establish a relationship with history, with inaugurations and speeches providing additional opportunities for patriotic propaganda. Lenman emphasizes that it was the men of the educated German middle class who, although they represented a minority at the time, were the protagonists of this propaganda and increasingly saw themselves as ambassadors of German culture, which was considered a source of national values. He points to the unequal participation of social groups in this process, with the working class excluded from the enjoyment of the arts and invisible to artists, even though the latter saw themselves as representatives of the entire nation. The historical sociologists Eric Hobsbawm and Benedict Anderson also share an understanding of nationalism as an intellectual construction, a perception that informed the studies of both Hagemann and Lenman. Hobsbawm views national traditions as well as beliefs and value systems as inventions intended to convey values and norms of behavior, and he views symbolically and emotionally charged signs as created to evoke a sense of group membership. Hobsbawm sees the crucial importance of history as being a reminder of belonging to a lasting political community. Elites are seen as the protagonists of this recent nation building. Anderson views nations as imagined political communities conceived as deep horizontal fellowships, and traces the concept to the great religious imagined communities of the Middle Ages, seeing the nation as a modern secular equivalent. socio-cultural production sample the war song Holde Nacht, dein dunkler Schleier decket, or in its translation, Graceful night, your dark veil covers. Graceful night, your dark veil covers my face perhaps for the last time. Tomorrow I will be laid low, struck from the list of the living. Tomorrow we will go into battle for our brethren and for the fatherland. But, oh dear, not everybody returns to where friends find each other in joy. Many an infant lies in the arms of its mother and does not feel her pain. She cries to the heavens for mercy and holds him close to her heart without hope. A happy boy jumps about and asks, "Mother, when is our father coming home?" Poor child, your father lies in his grave. His eyes do no longer see the rays of the sun. Here we see already a hero covered in sand. The girl is an orphan, so is the boy. There lies a son struck down, his parents' breadwinner in old age. Young girl, don't mind about matrimony, don't consider joy and the wedding dance, because love is already buried in the sand and swings high above the dead ring. It is sad to see our brothers here and there again in crippled state, but it is still a holy duty to courageously confront our enemies in battle again. When the bullet of the enemy strikes me down, my spirit will rise high with joy. Oh, who knows if we will meet again? Therefore, my friends, farewell. Interpretation of the song lyrics. The feeling of an imaginary community is expressed in the song Holde Nacht, in the first two lines of the second verse. Tomorrow we go to fight for our brothers and for our fatherland. It was this feeling of belonging to and defending a group that was meant to mobilize the listeners to be willing to sacrifice their lives. The human experience of change over time is described by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur as the characteristic element of narrative texts. Although the lyrics of the song Holde Nacht are limited in their narrative content, they also represent a change in time that is triggered by the war. Describing life in peacetime and contrasting it with life shattered by war, the song expresses in 8 verses the anticipation of loss and grief that the experience of war holds in prospect. There are multiple subjects in the narrative of the song's lyrics: the individuals and the groups affected by the war. The respective subject changes in each stanza, starting with the individual soldier in the first, which is made clear by the use of the first person singular. Tomorrow already I lay stretched out. In the second stanza, the perspective is extended to the soldiers as a group, which is expressed through the use of the first person plural. Tomorrow we go for our brothers. In the following 4 stanzas, the subject switches to the infant and his mother, the boy and his mother, a boy and a girl who become orphans, parents who lose their son, and a young girl who loses her prospect of marriage. The third person singular is used in those 4 stanzas. Stanza 5 returns to the group of soldiers, expressed by the first person plural. Sad, sad that we have lost our brothers. And stanza 6 to the individual soldier in the first half of the stanza, and finally to the group of soldiers expressed in the last half of the stanza by the first person singular or plural respectively. The song reflects the situation on the eve of battle, in which the prospect of death, injury, and loss is expressed from the perspective of those affected by the war. The view of those who indirectly experience the war, here the soldiers individually and as a group, frames the view of those who are indirectly affected by it, friends and relatives at home. The French literary theorist Gérard Genette defines 3 aspects of narrative time: order, duration, and frequency. Applied to the lyrics of the song, we find the use of the adverbs tomorrow, morning already, immediately, and soon in 6 of the 8 stanzas. This makes it clear how much the feeling of expectation is present in the verses of the song. The reference to duration appears in the first stanza, for the last time, and in the last stanza, ever and forever. The use of superlatives here creates emotional intensity and gives the situation drama and the impression of finality. The last line is a farewell call and reinforces this impression. We only find the frequency in the sense of repetition in verse 7, in which the soldier's duty to face the enemy again is mentioned. These last 2 lines of the 7th verse and the following 2 lines of the 8th verse contrast with the main body of the song, which can be seen as a lament and expression of the experience of loss and fear of loss from a variety of perspectives. While the last 2 lines of the 7th stanza a patriotic perspective, in which it is a sacred duty to face the enemy in battle, in the next 2 lines death in battle is presented as a heroic act. This means that what looks like a defeat from the outside becomes a victory from this perspective. The contrast between being shot down by the enemy's bullet, tears me down like the enemy's bullet, and the joyful ascension of the spirit, my spirit soars joyfully high, further expresses this paradox. All 4 lines reflect the political propaganda of the time, in which participation in the war was presented as a heroic and worthy obligation. Interestingly, it is precisely in these lines that a strong connection to religion and spirituality is established. The duty of going into battle is a sacred duty, and after the soldier is struck down, it is his spirit that rises with joy. No such reference to spirituality or religion is made in the other parts of the song. The enemy is only named in these lines. In all other verses, it seems to be the war itself that destroys lives and causes loss and pain on many levels. The only other patriotic element in the song is found at the beginning of the 2nd verse, where going to war is portrayed as a victorious, altruistic act. Tomorrow we go to fight for our brothers and for our fatherland. The 2nd stanza is therefore connected to the lines of the 7th and 8th stanzas and their propagandistic orientation. It is these lines that probably made it possible for the song to be approved of as an official war song. In all other parts of the song, the lyrics become emotionally charged due to the song's focus on human relationships. The bond between friends, the relationship between child and mother, between a child and his parents, a son and his aging parents, a young girl and her lover. The plaintive element is reinforced by the use of contrasts, where positive emotions are nullified by the destructive experiences of war. The boy jumping around happily asking when his father will return, while the father is long buried. The girl who receives a funeral wreath instead of a wedding dance. The young mother who holds her baby hopelessly close to her heart. Romantic metaphors that refer to nature, such as the fair night that covers the soldier's face with a dark veil, the eye that no longer sees the sun's rays, the hero that is already covered by sand, the mother that cries out to heaven for mercy, further contribute to the emotional character of the song and reinforce the impression of tragedy. That fear, sadness, and pain are prominent among these emotions is clearly demonstrated by the repetition of the adjective sad at the beginning of stanza 7, the use of the adjective poor, the noun pain, and the verbs scream and cry. According to Toulon, both adjectives and actions can provide clues to characterization and help distinguish between perpetrator and victim. Since the adjective and action mentioned above are used in connection with the subjects of the song, the poor child, the mother, in her pain, cries out to heaven, the subjects are thereby identified as victims, which is confirmed by the repeated use of the verb stretched out and the verb erased, both in passive mode. War itself can be defined as a perpetrator in this context through its destructive effects. The overall tone of the text, written from the perspective of the victims, is therefore one of fear and dark foreboding, despite its optimistic patriotic insertions. Conclusion. While the song Holde Nacht reflects the experience of war by those directly and indirectly affected through its effects, it expresses the feelings of fear, pain and loss, but it also contains the patriotic elements characteristic for war songs of the time. However, these patriotic lines contrast with the overall tone of the lyrics and seem more obligatory than personally motivated. Here it becomes clear that the patriotic perspective was a view imposed from outside and not a way of seeing that emerged from personal experience. The history of the song is also interesting. The German linguist and folklorist Wolfgang Steinitz assumes that the song Holde Nacht, whose author is unknown, was written by a member of the Prussian military and dates from the war years 1813 to 15. According to Steinitz, it made such a deep impression on the soldiers and made them so wistful that it was banned in some of the troops. The song Holde Nacht was widely distributed through pamphlets since the beginning of the War of Liberation. A contemporary reports, "In 1813 I often heard the soldiers and later the young people singing. The song always made a moving effect on me, the boy. As with me, so with others." The important role that interpersonal relationships play, as discussed in Chapter 1, is evident in the song Holde Nacht. It was the anticipation of the loss of these relationships that touched the soldiers so deeply before the battle, making them think not only of themselves and their own impending death, but of all those who would be affected by it. Patriotic propaganda also took advantage of the importance of emotional interpersonal relationships and used terms that suggested a close interconnection, fatherland, brotherhood, to motivate soldiers to fight. The idea of social community was already fundamental to the French Revolution, with its call for freedom, equality, and fraternity. However, the call for equality was used to introduce universal conscription, which resulted in revolutionary armies becoming large enough to fulfill imperialist ambitions. Thus, the desire for equality, which questioned the concept of inequality on which imperialism was based, was turned into its opposite, and the need for social cohesion, fraternity, was exploited in order to win the population over to imperialist military campaigns. The Prussian Wars of Liberation were a reaction to Napoleon's imperialist invasion, and a similar patriotic nationalist discourse became necessary to convince the population of the German principalities of the need for participation in military service and to mobilize them for the wars. Hagemann describes how the idea of nationalism promoted by the German middle class at this time was based on concepts that had developed since the mid-18th century. According to Hagemann, the idea of the nation was in this context a cultural construction created by the men of the German educated middle classes. The patriotic national discourse, the forms of representation of the nation, and the practice of the national movement were therefore shaped by their fears, wishes, needs, hopes, and visions. In this context, Hagemann emphasizes that these men were more affected than any other social group by the economic, social, political, and cultural changes caused by war and revolution, and experienced mental disorientation and socio-cultural insecurity that also affected their self-image and masculinity. fact that there is a connection between a problematic gender identity and violence was already mentioned in Chapter 1. The characterization of the German man as brave and offensive, and of the German woman as domestic and religious, promoted by German patriotic writings, comes close to what Scheff describes as hypermasculine and hyperfeminine types. According to Scheff, these types arise when experiences of either shame, loss, or humiliation are not processed. The feeling of loss of social connection that arises from these experiences on a personal level can be compared to the feeling of loss of social connection that the men of the German educated middle classes experienced since the end of the 18th century. Hagemann points out that the national myths, symbols, and rituals, as well as the ideal of male defensiveness, which were created back then to mobilize the population for the wars of liberation, have remained relevant to this day. Quotes from contemporaries confirm that the French wars, sieges, and the collapse of the empire were experienced by many as humiliation. The geographer August Seune bitterly noted in 1808 that the Germans were treated like animals, exchanged, given away, and trampled on, like a ball passed from one hand to the other. In a brochure published in 1806 by the Nuremberg bookseller Johann Philipp Palm entitled Germany in its Deepest Humiliation, it says, "Without emotion, a German cannot even look at the humiliation of his fatherland, much less feel it personally and speak about it publicly." Scheff emphasizes that experiences of shame and humiliation, if not acknowledged and processed, have the potential to lead to violent actions. The fact that an acknowledgement of the experience of humiliation at that time was not possible was made clear by the fact that Philipp Palm was in the same year convicted to death by Napoleon and publicly executed for publishing the brochure Germany in its Deepest Humiliation.